Okay, so thank you very much. I'm now going to introduce each of the three members of our panel today. I'm really excited for this discussion. Um, and then ask them to talk for a few minutes about how they've come into this space of science communication and the role of science and art, how they can mutually inspire each other and be a force for communication. So I'll start with introducing Miriam Sturdee, who is a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in the School of Computer Science, focusing on the intersection between computing and the arts, and is especially interested in how arts-based approaches can inform technical fields within STEM. Miriam, do you want to say a few words about what you're working on?
Yes, hello. So my background, I originally studied psychology, worked for a number of years, have a master's in fine art, and then a PhD in and research master's in computer science. So it's very much close to my heart to bring those things together. Currently working on, I think I've got a long-term relationship with looking at designing shape-changing interfaces. I'm also looking at different approaches to usability for novel interfaces. And as a sideline, I'm currently interested in tabletop role-playing games and how they could actually be used within computer science to help educate and inspire people.
Thanks very much, Miriam. Now I would like to call on, sorry, I'm also trying to pin people and unpin people. I'd like to now call on Joseph Lindley to say a few words. He's a senior research fellow at Imagination Lancaster. He aims to capture and communicate the value of design research, showing its relevance to help address the 21st century's socio-technical challenges. Let me just unpin Miriam. And Joseph, can you say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everybody. So my kind of genesis story is that I finished school where I was mainly into maths and science and things like that, but also quite like music. I finished school without any proper qualifications and I couldn't go to university. I ended up then working for one of the UK's largest supermarkets in the IT department as an apprentice. And during that period, learned to code and make databases and things like that. I was an IT professional for about 4.5 or 5 years until one day I met a guy at a party who told me about this degree course he was doing at university called Interactive Arts. And it sounded great to me. I phoned them up and had a meeting with the course director. And at the end of that meeting, he said, "Would you like to come?" And I didn't actually think it was possible for me to go to university because of the lack of qualifications. But by that point, I was a so-called mature student at the ripe old age of 22 or something. And so I went to do this art degree, and it was called Interactive Arts, but it wasn't really focusing on making interactive artworks. It was just a completely open-ended course where you could do anything you wanted. And I learned to experiment in all kinds of creative ways there. After that, I tried to make a living and have a career being an artist and a musician, but there wasn't very much money around and it was a bit difficult to survive. So I ended up managing a team of about 20 in the UK's National Health Service. So I was a manager of a small service. After a couple of years of that, I had a particularly hard day at work and was looking for alternative employment. And this is when I accidentally opened an advert for a PhD program that was, it called itself post-disciplinary, and it was particularly interested with people having experience in technology, in art and design, and in management. And I thought maybe I could persuade my way onto that course, and I did. So I got my PhD there in, I think officially it was in digital innovation, but I was actually exploring a thing called speculative design. So this is an approach to future studies or foresight studies, but using design as the main process, the main research method in there. Since then, I did some postdoctoral positions, and in 2020, I received a fellowship from UK Research and Innovation, which buys my time for 4 years, and I have a small team of postdoctoral researchers as well. And the purpose of that fellowship was in the introduction. That's really to gather evidence of and demonstrate the value of design as a method of understanding some of the world's global challenges that we're facing, these huge big problems, such as sustainability, such as what to do about AI, such as how to live with all these technologies that we've created in the last 20, 30 and 50 years. So that's a short version of my history, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much, Joseph. And then I'd like to introduce our third panel member today, Peter Weingart. He's a Professor Emeritus of Sociology, Sociology of Science and Science Policy at the University of Bielefeld, interested in science advice to politics, science media interrelation, and science communication. Welcome, Peter. Would you like to say a few words about your way into this area?
Well, I as you said, I was a professor of science policy, sociology of science, and eventually got interested in the issue of how much should science open up to society. In the early days of that discussion, the issue was how to overcome the resistance of the scientific community to communicate with the public. But then I got a chair offered long after my retirement for science communication in Stellenbosch in South Africa. Had never been specializing in science communication proper. Now I had the task to sort of argue for it, and I did, but became more and more critical of it because of the kind of political capture of science communication as a means to sort of propagandize science for various reasons. And so now I'm working, or continue to work, on the implications that this kind of policy has for science communication proper. What is it? What are the effects on the trust in science? And of course, and we'll discuss that later, probably about what you call the ethics of science communication. In other words, how should science communication be organized apart from or in opposition to public relations? Let me finish there.
Thanks very much, Peter. Okay, so I'd like to pose a first question to you. We've been thinking about some topics that we'd like to talk about today. And I'll start with maybe the most straightforward question or topic, which is, what do you think is the role of art? And I'm using art in the most inclusive sense possible, to include board games, like you were talking about, Miriam, right through to design and music, visual arts. What role do you see of art in science communication? How is it kind of come to rise in prominence, and what is its role?
I'm happy to start for 10. I think in a way science communication is an art, and it's something that's evolving. So it might have started off with bulletin boards and newsletters, but as we've sort of developed more and more exciting innovations and things that do directly affect people's lives in a way they can understand or use, then we've become more creative as well in developing those approaches. So it has to go beyond just a written sheet of paper, because people don't want to stop and read anymore. They want to be immersed. They want to have things presented to them, and they want to play with them and see them in a different way.
What do you think, Joseph?
I'll jump in. I mean, I'm not a domain expert in science communication, but as a big fan of science, I consume quite a lot of it through, I don't know, publications like The New Scientist or an array of YouTube channels, things like the Veritasium, that kind of channel. I think most science communicators are scientists, not artists. They may draw upon the arts or hire an artist to help them communicate an aspect of the story. And I think that's a thing to be expected. As communication and figuring out novel ways and accessible ways of conveying information is a thing that people in the arts have probably traditionally trained in and practiced in more than scientists may have done as part of their core training. But in that configuration where you have science communication, which is an activity and an interest and a domain of study in its own right, and how it intersects with the arts, the main way I see that is as a kind of an instrumental thing where artists might help a science communicator who's probably come from a science background to do their job better. And that's well and good. But as I probably alluded to in my introduction, the thing I'm really passionate about is more actually the intersection of where the arts becomes part of the science. But I realize that's a different question. Maybe we'll get onto it later. But yeah, I just think by and large, what I see is artists, designers, creative people helping science communicators to do their job better, as artists and creative people do in all kinds of domains.
So it's up until now, it's often seen as in an instrumental role, as a giving a voice or a creative voice, as a creative way of communicating the science of a scientist. Have you had some experiences with this, Peter? Have you seen examples of where they've tried to communicate science through art?
Well, as I mentioned before, the one connection, or let me mention two examples. One example, the establishment of the position of an artist in residence at an Institute of Advanced Study. As a matter of fact, nowadays several institutes have such a position and try to establish the connection between science and the art. Not to my knowledge anyway, has this ever been studied? In other words, has it ever been systematically analyzed? What happens when these scientists, these artists and residents come into these institutes? How do they interact with the scientists? In some cases, when they're painters, for instance, they interact, getting ideas from the scientists, and when they talk to each other, to then eventually paint their pictures. I'm not so sure about the other way around. In other words, how do the scientists profit from artists? In any case, I think it would be an interesting topic to study systematically. Another example, when I was at Stellenbosch, we had an event, scientific conference, and the suggestion by one of the members of the institute was, let's open this up with a theater group that she knew that was active in sort of interacting with scientists. And the theater group did their thing both at the beginning and the end of the meeting. And I asked myself, what have they told us now? What was our sort of takeaway message from the theater group, both in terms of what did I or could I have learned as coming from the sort of the scientific or scholarly side, but what could the audience have learned from this group? Now, I think it was just Miriam who said, you're sort of immersed in this kind of experience, and you enjoy it, and you're enthusiastic about it. And that, I think, is the kind of note that one often hears, namely, the general public, when being addressed by sort of artists in connection with science communication efforts, should be interested, their attention should be captured. They should be interested. They should become sort of amused or interested or whatever. I can see that that is a motive. The question then still remains, what is the message that they can take away as a public from what the scientists tell them? Well,
Right. This
quite
comes back.
frankly, I'm a bit skeptical.
This comes back to what Joseph was saying, that if the objective of good science communication is to communicate the scientific message, the fact, then art should be instrumental in that. But Miriam, your hands up. What would you've been thinking of? You talked about science communication as an art in itself, so perhaps that means it's not just an instrumental channel.
I mean, it comes back. Just wanted to mention what things that Joe was saying about bringing in an artist to help communicate the message. But I think one of the things that resonates with me about Joe's background and my own is that we have some point or another have been or are still artists. And having that interdisciplinary background is so valuable in putting out our own message for our own work. And we're both very successful at that. So I wonder if some of the issues of the art science dichotomy is because we don't have that pipeline, especially in the UK, where the arts are somewhat devalued at times. People aren't taking on those roles, but a great number of famous thinkers were also, there were artists and scientists, like Feynman, for instance, who was a very talented sketch artist and very creative, but also a massively wonderful scientific thinker. The other thing I wanted to say in response to Peter was that I just, while you were talking, I thought of an example where the artist in residence actually had an instrumental effect on the research itself. I think NASA, they had a sound artist come in who was creating musicscapes based on the electromagnetic emissions of the sun. And while they were making this music, they kept hearing a repeating pattern. And it turned out, I don't know the exact word for it, someone who's based in physics might know, but they actually discovered something new about the spectral emissions via their art. And I thought that was a particularly poignant example. But of course, I don't think a dance troupe might not be able to communicate results in quite the same way. But there is potential in using art to look at science from a different angle, which can lead to innovation. So I think that was what I wanted to say.
I was it's a slight segue, I guess, from science communication per se to the concept of an artist in residence, which I guess there's lots of different configurations of that. And it may be that the artist in residence might be there to help communicate wherever it is they're in residence, or it might be to critique some aspect of what's happening there. And in some circumstances, it could be to try and become part of the core activity. And so if it's an artist in residence in a scientific organization, they might be trying to get the artist involved in progressing the science. But it's also worth bearing in mind, it could be purely to be artistic. So where the art, whatever the artist in residence creates, is a end in its own right. And I think probably the reality is, for most artists in residence, a little bit of all of those things might come into play, but probably any of them are fine in their own right. And in particular, I draw attention to the fact that I think for some artists in residence, they just want to make art, and it's doing it in a particular environment with particular inspiration from the people around them, and that's okay. But there are examples of when that kind of activity progresses the engineering or progresses the science or the core interest of the host organization as well. I'll throw a quick one in, which was Christopher Frayling is a guy who pioneered the art and design practice-based research community in the UK. He was at the Royal College of Art for a long time. One of the examples he likes to draw upon was a new type of paint formula that it was developed by chemists. Basically, it was a new formulation for some chemicals that you could make new paint pigments with. But the team that pioneered this knew it was good and powerful, but didn't quite know what to do with it. And so they hired in some artists, and the artists, long story short, but made some beautiful stuff using this new technology. And that, for one, helped the scientists to see the kinds of things that you could do with it. But actually, the really interesting thing was that in that process, so the artist was just trying to make something pretty, but they actually figured out, by mixing multiple things together, discovered a new type of innovation and applying it to a new material. I think it was putting it on metal plates, which opened up a whole new avenue for the science. So there's just one more example to throw in there, and I guess the contention that there's more than one reason why you might have an artist there. It might be to communicate, to critique, to actually help drive things forward, or just to be an artist, and that's okay.
Fantastic. So this then moves maybe into the territory where, you know, there is this mutual inspiration. So where the artists perhaps take some inspiration from the scientific milieu that they're based in, and this inspires them to do some art, and perhaps that communicates a scientific message, or perhaps it's playful, it's experimental. And likewise, how artists can draw inspiration, or, you know, fertile new avenues for research via the kind of some of these examples you've just given. So what about then, could we talk about the art of science? Like perhaps there is more of a creativity and artistic flair to scientists than the kind of the stereotype of the boring person at the workbench might imply. What do you think about that, Miriam? I'll start with you again.
I actually think there's a huge case to be made for people in science to be tempted into making art or having an artistic practice outside of their science. I gave Feynman as an example, but there's also a paper which I will retrieve if anyone's interested, about how a lot of great scientists are also very creative and artistic. And I know for me, I bring that practice into computer science, but equally having it on the outside helps you focus and helps you get into a state of flow, and you can get some wonderful ideas. So I think I would encourage scientists to also be artists. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's something I'm quite passionate about, and I teach a lot of sketching and drawing skills to computer scientists who wouldn't pick up a pen or paper otherwise. And the value they do gain out of it, I get that, you know, it feeds back into what I do, and it is valuable for them, both to help them think and as a creative outlet.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Peter?
Well, just to remind you that in the 18th century, there was no division between art and science. The scientists, artists, engineers were, so to speak, one role, and the specialization that occurred later on happened mostly at the end of the 19th century. However, to throw in, so to speak, a grain of salt here, you can't rewind this evolution. In other words, the separation between arts and science will remain, maybe will even get more pronounced, so that the attempts to sort of reintegrate them are at best well-meaning. When Joe just said, well, it's good to have an artist in residence, then just for its own sake, that's fine. Let me just I almost forgot to mention this. I was involved in a research group lately, and we're looking at literature that is dealing with science. In other words, and these are called science novels. That is an interesting field because it's the way that writers look at science in various ways and write stories about them. But again, there are two different camps, and but they do interact in this sense. Yeah.
Joseph, do you have any thoughts on this
I do. I need to remember to not try and get all of the thoughts out in one go and stop talking, because I can ramble too much. But I think if we're thinking about mutual inspiration, so, you know, if you frame the question of what can the artist give to the scientist, or vice versa, you can come up with plausible answers to that question and probably add texture to those answers with examples. And you can probably argue that, yeah, there's, in some cases, scientists will benefit from having an artist in the room or from talking to an artist, and vice versa. My actual belief is perhaps in opposition to Peter's position, and I think it's great to have the conversation and to trying to turn it into something productive. So I'll sort of be deliberately slightly provocative here. I think we probably agree on most things anyway, but I think the separation is an illusion, really. I think you could argue, and it's as a model of thinking about this, you could argue that we just have practice. We have the activities that we decide to spend our time doing. And you may do that as a scientist, and you may do that as a musician or a poet or a designer or an engineer. And most of these things actually have a huge amount in common. To do them well, you have to do them a lot. You have to practice them and become an expert in your domain. I completely agree with the historical point that if you go back 300 years, that this was a much more closely connected space. There's this quote from John Constable, who was a landscape artist in the UK, that I really like, where he says, "Why then may not landscape be considered as a branch of natural philosophy, of which pictures are but experiments?" And so his point is that his painting practice is basically philosophy, but the way he expresses himself is through the images. So I quite like that conceit. And then I'll just throw in this quote from Francois Jacob, who was a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and he talked about the science of the nighttime. And his point of view is that all scientists by day present this view of being a super rational person who will methodically follow their particular experimental structure in order to adhere to what we might refer to as the scientific method and essentially prove or disprove a hypothesis. But in the nighttime, the same people embrace their intuition, and they have crazy thought experiments of what could be possible, and in fact go through all the same kinds of processes that artists would do. And that's a necessary part of science. You don't just spontaneously have an idea for the right experiment. You have to have a creative thought in there. Conversely, many, many artists don't just purely exist in hyper creativity space. They're not just being a stereotypical person chopping off their own ear and doing crazy things just for the sake of it. They have a method there as well. They understand science. They understand the engineering constraints. So I think the division is actually something of a fallacy. And if we could accept that and be a bit more free, perhaps everybody could benefit. That's my provocation there.
But perhaps, so what I've heard from Peter is how kind of separated the sciences and the arts have been, at least institutionally. I mean, what's formally defined in certain social settings, but the actual in the doing, there is a lot more of a blending that scientists are actually drawing on their creative nighttime, or as someone's just put in the chat, Friday afternoon experimenting, and likewise, artists are also drawing on science. In my small interactions with artists, I've also seen that, of course, that they are drawing a lot on state-of-the-art computing technologies and things like this. It's certainly not so what about then if we can kind of flip that round? So we see that there's a there's a creativity in the practice and the doing of science that's perhaps not talked about, but is constantly there. What about art itself as being a form of science? So you, Joseph, were talking about, you quoted Constable, and Constable starting to think that actually he's undertaking something like a scientific inquiry through his art. Do you guys have any other examples of this, or what do you think is the potential there? Anyone can start.
I'll go in again, and I'll give a very brief answer this time. So I believe, and this connects to the point I was making previously, I believe that art and design and any creative endeavor can be an epistemology. It can be a mechanism of knowledge production in its own right. That's what Constable was getting at with that quote. To give you an example of what that could mean in practice, imagine that you're an alien and you've never been on this planet before. You don't know anything about any of our materials. And I give you a lump of clay, let's say, and you play around with that clay. You mess around with it. You start to understand its material properties. And quite quickly, you'll have figured out that over 2 or 3 hours, it starts to go hard. That changes how it feels in your hand, and it changes its strength. And you probably learn how tall you can make it without it falling over. I don't know what you'll learn, but if you mess around with it for a couple of hours, you'll learn something. Now, that messing around is a creative process. That's like an art-like process. And the learning is essentially research. It's a kind of science. It's an acquisition of knowledge. So that's a way that, a very simple example of how a creative process can lead to understanding. So I think art in its own right is an epistemology. It is a science.
Well, I guess in the same space, someone who's messing around with cells and things is just doing it in a very structured way so they can record their results. And I know that many artists, if they're using materials, they'll have sketches and they'll have experiments and material testers and patches and all sorts of things before they commit to a final piece. And many artists use, chemical engineering and things to create, metal plates of different products and materials. So I completely can agree with Joe's approach. Someone has their hand up, I think.
I'm just saying we're going to collect questions to the end. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So Manghild, Anna, I sent a few other questions. We'll keep those to the end. But please, while we're on this topic, then, science is epistemology. Science is method.
Yeah, I just wanted. I agree with most of what you say. Just wanted, being a social scientist, I have to say there's a difference between epistemology and science. You could say yes, all kinds of, so to speak, interactions with nature or with reality have some kind of epistemology. The arts are not a science. These are two different kinds of institutionalization. The arts are institutionalized in different ways. I mean, you don't have to go into that. I think you have to agree to that. But so in other words, there's a distinction, and the interesting questions then are, how do they differ, being given the fact that they originated and being identical, or being one entity, not identical, but being one entity. And how do they differentiate? What are the differences? So for instance, what are the differences when you say that the art is knowledge production? What are the differences in certification, methods of certification, ways of retaining something as given, or in opposition to that, the changing fads, for instance, in art and in science. We have fads in both areas. That would make for interesting comparisons.
I could say a couple of things, if that's appropriate.
Yeah.
One, I think framing different kinds of institutionalization is key. And how these specializations and disciplines have developed over the last couple of 100 years and found their way into siloed institutions is central to why we end up having this kind of conversation. So I completely agree with that. But I don't think there's a fundamental incompatibility in the practices and what those practices mean, but there's a socially constructed kind of layer on top of that. And right through to our identities, you know, you introduce yourself as a social scientist, Peter, and someone else in the room might say, well, I'm a biologist. And the labels are necessary to aid communication, but they perhaps don't reflect the common ground that might lie beneath, is my opinion. On the second thing, with certification and ways of sort of maintaining knowledge, if I understood what you were getting at right, there's two things I'd share from the world of research through design, which is part of what I'm talking about as creative practice as a means of knowledge production. There's an idea called programmatic knowledge. So the fact of the matter is, if you're using design to do research or art to do research, unlike a more scientific experiment where you'd hope to be able to reproduce an experiment and get the same result, with this kind of creative research endeavor, you would expect and want a different result. That's part and parcel of the practice of the method. And that's because the kind of knowledge that you produce is not a proving or disproving of a hypothesis. It's an intermediate knowledge that can be used sometimes critically of some complex situation and sometimes generatively. And to give hopefully a concrete example of this, when the iPhone was a new thing and a game came out called Flappy Bird, I think, and the idea with the Flappy Bird was you would tap the screen, that would make the wings of the bird flap, and you had to avoid some obstacles. And this created a very novel interaction with the iPhone, which no one had ever made before, where it's intermittently tapping the screen. After that game came out, thousands of other app developers used that interaction in many other different ways. That's an example of intermediate knowledge, where the creative act of making the game figured out a new way to do things. That's not a universal theory of how to do all interactions with a smartphone screen, but it was a generative piece of innovation. That's the kind of way that intermediate knowledge, which is often the result of these art and design practice-based research endeavors, is an example of how intermediate knowledge can be put into practice. Then the addendum to that is programmatic research. So if you're trying to understand interactions with smartphones, or how do we educate about AI, or some big research question, and you've got artists and designers contributing to it, the real meaning comes from a program of research, not from individual experiments, but from maybe 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 experiments building up over time. So again, there is some similarity there in that science obviously builds on the shoulders of giants, builds on what's come before. But because it's intermediate knowledge, that following the thread through there is a bit more tricky, and it's kind of incompatible with many of our notions of what knowledge should be. I think there's a tendency that we want to know that if something's been published and peer reviewed, then it's the truth, whereas obviously things do change over time. So hopefully that was somewhat relevant to what you were talking about, Peter, with certification and so on. But maybe it was a different point.
So it seems, I mean, this raises then, I guess these are relatively old questions about how we delineate science from other ways of knowing, right? I mean, there are certainly a lot of other ways of knowing, traditional knowledge systems, local knowledge systems, and others, which follow some kind of systematic knowledge gathering system that in a lot of ways does resemble science, and it's difficult to be able to call one scientific and the other unscientific. Do you think then that, so if we say that we started out talking about the role of art in science communication as at least traditionally being used in quite a utilitarian way as a channel through which to communicate the scientific message, and certainly that's an important role, And then now we've kind of started to move around to seeing them, well, actually, perhaps there's some kind of mutual inspiration going on. Actually, perhaps there's art and science tangled up in the same practice in a lot of time, in some ways, not always. I guess a lot of scientific practices are quite, quite separated from that. But my question then would be, is it this institutionalization that has been reinforcing this idea that science is rather that art is a communication voice? Go, Miriam. Yeah.
So as someone who does research that is not seen as traditional computer science, I do get accused of people ask what the point is, and they don't understand it. And you'll have reviews sometimes for papers that use visual or creative methods to elicit requirements for a system. And someone says, oh, this isn't empirical, obviously using empirical in the wrong sense of the word. And people have this idea of art and design things as soft skills that aren't valuable. And I think that, unfortunately, is prevalent both in academia and people in society. They think science is the be all and end all. And I think the institutions, like Peter was saying, they are responsible for that split away from all inquiry being good inquiry. And especially in the UK, if you've written a really interesting paper about computers, but you're in the wrong school, you can't submit it for your ref, which is where the government decide if the university is doing world-leading research. And conversely, if I, in computer science, want to put on an exhibition of interactive artworks, the exhibition is not worth anything to my department for those reasons. So, and yet in universities and everyone is saying, oh, we want interdisciplinary work. But again, the funding bodies, they're getting better, but they're still putting those barriers on what constitutes research under a certain umbrella. So EPSRC or EPSRC, however you call them, want you to study things that are definitely STEM, whereas AHRC, which is the Arts and Humanities Council, want you to do things that are, actually, I think they're a bit more open. They do dabble in things like AI, but for a long time it was, an us or them sort of way of thinking. And I really hope that if the funding councils are making these changes, the universities themselves are going to start to see the value in bringing everyone together.
So maybe last kind of question that I'd like to pose to you, and then we'll go open up for other people's questions. But under what conditions do we think we can make this work? I mean, you were saying earlier, Peter, I think there's a really important point that there perhaps needs to actually be more study into what is happening when you put an artist in residence in a scientific, like some kind of systematic study of what's going on. What are these different processes that you've been talking about, Joseph, this kind of being critical, being creative, being playful, communicating a message, maybe all of the above at the same time in some way. But under which conditions do you think that we need to nurture this kind of mutual inspiration and kind of collaboration between art and science, rather than having art as a mouthpiece for science, rather having them as collaborators and communicating certain kind of ideas or experiences? What do you think we need to focus on institutionally, ethically? Peter, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, as I said before, you can't turn back the clock. In other words, the separation, institutional separation, will remain and maybe even get stronger. However, if I reach out to what Joel and Miriam said, there are areas in science which lend themselves to this kind of reaching out. I'm thinking of my own field, where a colleague of mine especially is looking at research that is being done together with lay people. In other words, some comes under the label of citizen science, or living labs, or this kind of thing, So these are areas where, if they are if they are organized properly, probably attention can and should be paid to the connections between, so to speak, what goes on in the heads of people who are engaged in, say, a living lab. That has, at first anyway, very little to do with the disciplines that are involved, but can be very productive, can be made productive for the particular objective that is being pursued. I think that there should and has to be a reflection on that. In other words, there has to be sort of an ongoing study of what they're doing in order to profit most, because then you will eventually be able to say, this is the way to organize a living lab in order to make it be productive. Another issue is that probably, maybe, I mean, I'm just speculating, but these types of organization, we did a study of citizen science projects in South Africa, for example. Most of these projects were not even aware of some of the conditions under which they were operating, what made them be successful or not, and especially did they have any objectives to educate the people that were parts of these projects. They came mostly either being initiated by scientists, asking the citizens, the citizens that are taking part, to collect data for them. In other words, they made them be helpers, in many cases unpaid helpers. Very little, if any, efforts were made to sort of ask themselves, after a project has been finished, what have the citizens learned? What was their profit, et cetera, et cetera. These are just examples, and so I think one should look at these kinds of new forms of research. They're not systematic, they're not experimental, they're mostly social science or related, and therefore are often also considered weak. The range of different epistemologies in science is huge, ranging from something that could be very close to arts, which are considered, less sort of experimental and less disciplined, all the way out to, what have you, high energy physics. And I think that alone tells you that it's very hard to make general statements about the connection.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Miriam? What kind of conditions do you think we need to change? Peter said that we need to go into these more extended modes of science, but to do it with some kind of systematize it in rigor and study it as well. What do you think?
I think, it's a cool viewpoint. I also, but something that I was thinking about while Peter was talking was we need to turn the science communication inside and perhaps communicate better between ourselves before we even think about communicating with the public. And I think it is about a re-education and trying to get back to that point where all inquiry is of value. And I think if you've ever met an artist doing a PhD, you'll see that they are systematic and rigorous, and they do have those records because they need them, because within the arts process is of the utmost importance to be able to demonstrate the reproducibility of what you're doing and how you approached it and what your thoughts were. And I think that's something that in computer science isn't always, that process-based way of doing things isn't always obvious. But when you start to think about any science as more of an artistic method, then you can start showing your modes of thinking and ways of doing. So I think that we should both learn from each other in that respect. I mean, each other being art or science.
Joseph.
So during the pandemic, we had this thing where the Prime Minister of the UK, who at the time was Boris Johnson, would get up and do a press conference every day. And the thing he said almost every day was, we will follow the science, we'll follow the science, and that will be the right thing to do. And I think Peter highlighted this. There's so much that doesn't really mean anything. The science isn't a thing. You can't follow science. But I think the reason that story connects with people and why a politician would say it is there's a kind of, in non-specialized communities in particular, like outside of the academy, there's this kind of perception of science as an almost godlike structure that goes through everything and has the answer. Whereas we know in reality that experimental psychology, randomized control trials, and particle physics are completely different epistemologies, in the same way that we can learn very different things from poetry or a fine art practice, sculpture, urban design, or architecture. We can learn stuff through all of these activities, and they all have quite different epistemologies and ways of constructing knowledge. So what I think is we should, what environment do we need to do this stuff better? I think we should teach from primary school upwards kind of a little bit about how you know what you know. Obviously, you don't need to be an expert in all these things, and you don't need to become an epistemologist at age 6. But I think just acknowledging different types of knowledge, particularly in a kind of post-truth era and in a world that's changing so quickly, I think that could be a really profound way of starting to address this for future generations. For our generations, I don't know. I think we're doing the best we can, but we need to look to the future.
And of course, you were saying something earlier, Miriam, as well, which I think we need to bring up again here, which is that we're not incentivized to work in these other spaces. You know, as scientists, for example, we might really believe in working with artists to kind of communicate or to come up with new insights, but that's not as valorized as a traditional scholarly publication in our field. Now we have some time for some questions. I think we had Anna first, and then Manghild. Anna, do you want to ask?
Yeah, hi. That was a really interesting panel discussion. I absolutely loved it. And I did put my hand up quite early on. That question has just slipped my mind now. But now I wanted to, just looking at the conversations, I think we are coming down to the point of, well, we are living in an information overload age. And how do we sift through all of that information? Because I think that's where the key is. Because with science, the idea is, well, we've got one way of evaluating science, the reproducibility, or there is a clear structure, but again, that only applies for some hard sciences, definitely not for the area that I work in, which is closer to an art practice, I guess, because I investigate fatigue in humans. So it's a lot more difficult to pin it down as a scientific method, all of the methods that I use. So, but then let's look at it from the other way. How do we evaluate the information that comes through? And that's one of the reasons why social sciences are normally considered as a bit weaker, because it's harder to evaluate. And if the sort of intermediary knowledge is more easily amenable to evaluation, then, I mean, I would love to collaborate with artists, and I have done so in the past, but it's been quite difficult precisely for this reason. So the evaluation just comes into play. And that, again, the bigger question of there's just so much information, so much science, so much art out there. How do we actually bring it all together so everyone benefits? Anyway, that's sort of what I wanted to raise.
Good question. Do we have, very good, thanks, Anna. Do we have some short answers on that? Because we want to ask maybe one or two more questions.
Very short answer. I think the only way we can make sense of it is let people find things they're interested in and follow it. So maybe, I don't know, I mean, so I find social media is useful for picking up on things I might not have known I was interested in. But then again, it's full of, my timeline's also full of hate and cat videos. So it's overloaded in itself. But I think at least guiding people towards an area they might be interested in and letting them explore that area is the most important thing.
I'll be quick. This is a flippant answer, but large language models, get AI to do it for you. Tell me the truth. That's a bit of a joke, but I actually do think there's potentially you could look to technology to assist you in assimilating a kind of a position that considers multiple other positions. Going back to my prior point about teaching people to think critically about how they know what they know, pragmatism, a kind of, if that was a bit of training that everybody had, to be aware that you can choose the right model or the right framework to make sense of a particular situation, accepting that there's going to be other ones. If everybody accepted that, I think it would be easier for these kind of interdisciplinary endeavors to take place. But it's fundamentally, it is hard. It's really tricky. And
I think I was just basically thinking about it not from a personal perspective, but in terms of how about these funding agencies? They struggle to do interdisciplinary work purely because of evaluation. That's my assessment of why that's really not taken off. So from a funding perspective, I think this is really critical. From an individual perspective, yes, we all find our own ways of identifying what information is reliable and what's not. But I think it kind of hits the sort of bigger problem of funding.
I'm going to take the question from Magnhild. Magnhild, do you still have a question?
Yes. Thanks for that panel discussion. That was really, really interesting. I don't have a question. It's more a comment or a reflection that I was thinking about when you were talking about the differences and similarities between working as an artist and as a scientist. I worked with Scott a bit. I'm a visual artist, and I'm doing a PhD in artistic research, and we've collaborated in Scott's research project calendars, and it's been really rewarding. But the example that I'm thinking of now is a workshop that I'm going to be doing on artificial intelligence, where I reached out to scientist, a sociologist that I've been working with before, because I'm going to do a workshop in Bergen where we research AI, generative AI, through 3D modeling and producing physical objects. And when the scientist that I've been collaborating with before, Gabriel De Seta, he then sent me this research paper that he had been writing called Synthetic Ethnography, where he's proposing, together with two other researchers, a new methodology for doing ethnographic studies, which is basically using AI tools in this kind of hands-on way to do projects that are quite like art projects, actually, and through doing that, figuring out how these tools work and what they mean to the communities where people are working with them. And when I read this paper and talked to him afterwards, I said that this is so much like actually the method that I propose doing in this course, and it's such a kind of common artistic strategy. And then he said that, oh yes, this is very like common artistic method, but academics don't know that. And I thought that was quite funny that he's proposing this this method, which is a really common artistic methodology, as a new form of kind of sociological study, and made me think about how sometimes the way that artists work and scientists work might not be actually so very different.
Thanks, Megan. Any comments on that, or?
I was just thinking how I went to Joe, actually I think Joe was there as well. We went to a software engineering conference, and we found that many of the things we were talking about had been reproduced entirely independently, like the sort of design or artistic approaches within that particular mini silo. And I think every discipline reinvents the same things and just says, we've discovered this new way. I think like someone was using comics for science communication, said, look what we've done. And then I was like, well, we were doing that years ago. So everyone does like to reinvent these things and think it's all brand new, and perhaps it is in their field, but if there was a way of telling people these things existed in the first place, or if, like Peter said, everything was still together in one place, we wouldn't need to keep needlessly wasting time reinventing things.
I think we're going to wrap things up now, because we said it was going to finish at 3 and we've squeezed over that time. I thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to Miriam, to Joseph, and to Peter. Do you guys have any final reflections that you want to make as we close off? Short.
Thank you to everyone for being open-minded enough to want to learn more about arts and how they apply to science. And thank you for coming.
Perfect. That sums it up very nicely. Then we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Really interesting discussion. I really appreciated how we moved from the instrumental into the mutual inspiration space, and how we can actually make that happen. I hope we can each continue these conversations in our own spheres. Thanks very much, and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.